Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third World Accessibility Day session here with the Open LMS team. I am very happy to introduce our two speakers today, Jamie and Michael, who will be taking the floor here to walk everyone through some accessibility things. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And if anyone is looking for closed captioning, please head over to the Open LMS Facebook page where this is also being live streamed, and you can and there's a little settings button you can toggle to turn on closed captioning right there in the live stream. Over to you, Jamie and Michael.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I've just shared my screen. Want to make sure that pops up for us here. So you should be seeing a slide that says World Accessibility Day, or hearing me say the title World Accessibility Day. Welcome to the session. We're very excited to have you here. This is a session that we've been looking forward to for quite a while. I'd like to do a quick introduction of myself and then toss it over to my colleague, Jamie. But my name is Michael Vaughn. I'm a customer support specialist with eThink by Open LMS. I've been working with Moodle for just over a decade now and doing some form of accessibility training for close to a decade and a half. And I'm really excited to talk about some of the things that we've learned through that process, some of the things I've picked up over the years. And hopefully today is a little bit of a different approach to accessibility than you've seen in the past. So Jamie, I'd love to turn it over to you to do an introduction.
All right, so hello, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Jamie Aid, and I'm a customer solutions specialist here at Open LMS. And not only do I specialize in assisting with some accessibility items as it pertains to the LMS world, but I am also a disabled person. I have cerebral palsy and run a community for adults with cerebral palsy. And so I have a vested personal interest in the accessibility of the tools that I help to support. So thanks so much for being here, and let's get started. So today we will discuss the Global Accessibility Awareness Day, defining what that is. We'll talk a little bit about what accessibility means, because there's lots of different ways that you can take that word, and then the characteristics of accessible and inclusive design, as well as some tips for creating inclusive and accessible courses. So we're looking forward to that. So what is Global Accessibility Awareness Day? Well, it is today, Thursday, May 20th, 2021, and the purpose of World Accessibility Day is to get everyone talking and thinking and learning about digital access and inclusion. And inclusion means a lot of things. We'll get a little deeper into that as we discuss the content today, but really making sure that everyone is thought of and engaged in whatever content they're accessing online. And more than 1 billion, that's billion with a B, folks, more than 1 billion people have a disability. And it is estimated that 15% of individuals live with a disability. So while I represent part of that 15%, there are lots of individuals out there that you may know that also make up that portion of the population. So what does accessibility mean, and why is it important? Well, it's important because when we make things accessible, we open it up to the broader world. And no more was that evident than during the times of COVID, when we obviously rushed to adjust to what the new normal was in making things accessible and attainable to everyone, including those with disabilities. It makes up about 20% of your learner population and your user population. And it's important that everyone have the ability to engage in content and to brighten their horizons by participating online, whether that be for reasons like we've had recently, or just the fact that being online opens up your content to more people than just who can get to a brick and mortar location.
All right, and I'd love to talk about some of the challenges that come along with sessions on accessibility. There are quite a few people registered for this session, so my guess is there are quite a few of you who are watching now. My guess is you've probably been in other sessions on accessibility as well. And I've noticed a couple of common themes that tend to make those sessions just a little bit more challenging over time. Some of those sessions focus really heavily on the laws, and it's really hard to remember what those laws are even called, let alone what the intricacies of them mean. And sometimes those sessions come off feeling like the motivation is a punishment for not making content accessible rather than focusing on making learning as accessible as possible to all learners. I've also seen some that try and use interactive experiences to generate a bit of empathy for folks who are living with disabilities. And while those activities are sometimes well-intentioned, they do come off as feeling like you're playing disabled, and that's not really a good look. It feels a little off. While we do want to develop a little bit of empathy and understanding and trying to understand how someone else might access information in a different way from us, it's not as cool to pretend to have that type of an impairment. Some of those sessions focus on universal design for learning, or UDL, or just traditional accessibility. But we wanted to do something that's a little bit different for this session, because regardless of what type of accessibility trainings you've been in before, my guess is that they all ended the same way, and that was with the presenter or facilitator saying, but really, you should be incorporating accessibility by default. And if we're going to end all of our sessions that way, then why don't we start with that as our starting point for now? Before we really dig in, there are two things that I want you to keep in mind as really foundational values for this session. The first is that our personal abilities define our sense of what's normal. And let me give you a quick example of that. I would literally be at risk of losing my license if I were pulled over while driving without my glasses. I cannot see very well at all without my glasses, to the point where I am now legally required to wear them if I'm operating any sort of motor vehicle. But because I've always worn glasses, because my vision's always been well treated by an optometrist, I don't consider myself to be visually impaired, even though once I take these off, the screen is a complete blur to me. So my normal is being a sighted individual because my impairment is so well treated. Because of that, it's really easy for us to overlook people who are outside our own personal zone of normal. There was a really great example of this that happened about 2 years ago. There was a disabilities rights advocate in Indiana who was in court. He was invited to come speak at an event. It was a smart cities panel. It was when we design the city of the future, how do we make it accessible to everyone? And they forgot to add a ramp to the stage for them to actually join the rest of the panelists. So it's very easy for us to focus on our own zone of normal, which is whatever's normal for us. And it's easy for us to overlook people who are outside of that zone of normal. We also, and this is the second part, disproportionately focus on observable impairments. And it's not too surprising that we actually do this. This is pretty well supported through research. If you look outside of the box, this was one of my favorite studies from the 80s. What they did was they took a bunch of physics problems and they gave them to a group of physics students who had virtually no experience with physics, and then a group of physics professors who knew it so well they could teach it to others. And they said, go ahead and sort these problems based off of however you think they should be sorted. And the students did something where they looked at the problem, they said, oh, there's a box on a slope, so all the slopes, box problems should go together. So if I see a box on a slope, it obviously goes with the other problems that have boxes on slopes. In other words, and this is really important, they grouped the information based off of the superficially observable characteristics, the things that they could immediately see. Whereas the professors grouped the exact same information based off of the equation or equations that you would need to use to successfully solve those problems. In other words, the novices relied on the superficial characteristics they could observe, while the experts focused more on the underlying deeper neural networks of information they had developed through years of study and practice. So when I say we disproportionately focus on observable impairments, it's because most of the time we don't know very much about impairments in general, let alone the ones that don't affect us directly. And this is to the point where you may have noticed that the global symbol for accessibility is a person in a wheelchair. But physical impairments, which are pretty readily visible to others, like you can see it, you can observe it. It's kind of obvious if someone's using, let's say, a walking stick. Those only represent about 7% of all impairments and disabilities out there. So if we are overly focusing just on physical impairments, we are leaving out 93% of the disabled community. Now, in the digital world, we tend to focus on the big two in particular, and that is hearing impairments and visual impairments. So I want to encourage you to extend a bit beyond those. We will talk about some common strategies for making content more accessible to blind and visually impaired students and deaf or hearing impaired students. But it's also important that we expand our definition of what accessibility means to go well beyond that point, because there are quite a few conditions out there that can have a very big impact on a learner's ability to be successful that might be entirely invisible to you. If you have a student with Crohn's disease, for example, a student who is living with depression or anxiety, these are all things that have a big impact on their day-to-day lives, but are very easy to miss if they're either well treated, well masked, or we just don't know much about them. One really good starting point to consider is higher ed, because in the US in particular, because of the federal laws, most schools in higher ed have some sort of disabilities resources or accessibility services type of department that helps facilitate providing reasonable accommodations to students who need them. Because that data is registered, that data is shared, what we know is that for every 100 college students, at least in the US, 1 in 5 are registered with their school's Disability Resources Center. So we know that all of those students aren't necessarily blind or visually impaired or deaf or hearing impaired or have a mobility impairment. There's a lot of other stuff that's going on there. And a lot of times those registrations are actually for learning impairments, for mental impairments, or emotional impairments. And not only that, these learners suffer from something, it's basically just a medical term called significant comorbidity. And that means that usually when you are dealing with one condition, you are almost always dealing with a secondary condition or multiple secondary conditions as well, which is why very often when you have students who are diagnosed with anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder, as an example, they very frequently suffer from depression as well. Another common comorbidity is ADHD and anxiety. Now, it can be challenging enough to live with just one of these conditions, but life becomes much harder when they're combined with others. And again, the challenge is when these are well managed or well masked, it's really hard to tell that they're there unless it's disclosed to you. Anxiety in particular, if we look at this through the lens of, let's say, a mental and emotional health, we have 64% of all students who in 2019, based off of a national survey in the US and Canada, reported feeling overwhelming anxiety to the point where it made it difficult to function at some point in the last year. Now, that was for 2019, and then 2020 happened, so I would imagine that the stats might be a little bit different, and they're probably a bit higher now. But we tend to stereotype conditions that we don't know much about. If you were to look at my favorite stock photo site out there, which is pexels.com, and you search for the word depression, this is just a screenshot of the initial results. Nearly everyone's turned away from the camera. It's, empty, lonely road, a single coffee cup, things like this. And these are exaggerated views of what depression could look like. But depression could also look like this, where people are visibly happy, cheerful, spending time with others. People who live with chronic conditions or live with depression or anxiety or learning impairments, they're not incapable of experiencing joy or happiness or other positive emotions. It's just a lot harder to see if you don't directly know that that person's living with it. One thing that I tried to do in the past to encourage others to think through this lens was to do a little bit of a simulation to think, what would it be like if I was actually living with, let's say, anxiety or depression or some other type of impairment that is common but invisible. And again, having tried simulations in the past, sometimes they don't always feel right, and it wouldn't really be ethical for me to try and make you feel anxious or depressed. So instead, what I tried to do was encourage people to go through a decision-making type of simulation. And we don't have time for that today, but the reason I focused on this is because all of our lives come down to a series of daily decisions. And it turns out that making decisions is harder for some folks than others. One really helpful concept that I found several years ago that was invented by, it was a woman named Christine Miserandino, and she lives with a chronic illness, and she came up with something called the spoon theory to explain to others what it's like to actually live with a chronic illness. So to oversimplify this, she basically put 20 spoons on the table and she said, okay, when you, as a person not living with a chronic illness, have to make a decision, that's one spoon right there. Like, you take one spoon, that's your decision. But someone with a chronic illness who might have chronic fatigue, as an example, the same decision might cost them 4 spoons or 5 spoons. And all of a sudden they can't do as much with the rest of their day because it costs so much more to make those decisions. There's also some research surrounding that idea. It's a concept called ego depletion, and there's a little bit of controversy here. But generally speaking, the idea is that willpower is thought to be an inexhaustible resource. You might find that it's much harder for you to do things that are big or important at the end of the day than at the beginning of the day. And not only that, we know that stressful situations tend to cost us more, which is why the last time you were probably in a fight with someone who was really important to you, if that happened at the beginning of the day, my guess is you probably didn't get much done after that happened, unless you're one of those people who are just tremendously fueled by spite. Outside of that, it's really hard to get things done if you are put into a stressful situation. So that really brings me back to that idea of if we're supposed to be incorporating accessibility by default, and we know that decisions can be really difficult to make for folks who are living with some of these invisible impairments and conditions, then this is actually a bit of a design challenge from my perspective. So I think that we can look at this through characteristics of design when we're building things to begin with to talk about how we might actually make our content more accessible. Now, design in general, if we're asking what is design for, design's multi-purpose. It's meant to do a lot of different things. For example, design is meant to make it easy for people to get the things that they need. So this is an example of bad design, putting the back pain medication on the bottom shelf at the pharmacy. Right? Design's also meant to help clearly communicate to users what they're meant to do and what's expected of them. So this is one of my favorite images where it says credit card only, debit card only, cash only, no cash accepted, pay with cash or credit. Little confusing. Right? But if we're looking at what is design meant to do when we're applying it to creating learning situations and learning materials, design does three things in particular that we're going to focus on. So design simplifies choice. Right? If you're one of those people who suffers from like analysis paralysis when people give you too many options, one of the nicest things that people do for you that you have probably noticed is they come to you with just three choices and then you only have to pick from one of three things, and it makes life a lot simpler. Design also provides direction, so it lets you know where you've been, where you are, and where you are going next. But most importantly, in the learning context, really good design is going to reduce the burden of decision-making for students. If we think about COVID over the last year, it doesn't even have to be a documented medical impairment of some kind. It could be that we have students who have either had to go into quarantine or isolation. As an example, if you've been working in higher ed, you know that plenty of your students have probably been in and out of isolation over the past year. You could have learners or colleagues who just have family members or friends who have gotten COVID, who have gotten very sick, who may have passed away as a result of getting COVID. And that is obviously going to put a tremendous burden on them when they are trying to be successful in other areas of their life. Right? And those aren't even documented impairments. Those are just things that people are going through. So the general idea is if our life comes down to a series of daily decisions, then what can we do to reduce the burden of that decision making, not just for one person, but if we are doing it for like one person or a group of people, it usually means that we are doing a good job of reducing the burden for everyone and making things a bit more streamlined. So from a design perspective, I think that there are four characteristics of design that work really well for designing accessible learning materials and content and experiences. And I'm going to cover those in the rest of this session and then turn it back over to Jamie to talk a little bit about some of the tools you might be able to use. So the first characteristic is context. The second is compassion. The third is clarity. And the fourth is consistency. So let's break down each of these. Context in design is the information that exists between the information. And I promise I'm not going to do one of those things where like the presenter just dramatically overshares, but several years ago, I was in a serious relationship with someone who had the palate of a fourth grader. So, you know, there was not very adventurous food in that relationship. And when that relationship eventually ended, it was kind of like a personal renaissance for me from a cooking perspective. I just started to learn to cook all sorts of different things and incorporate all these different ingredients and elements that I'd always wanted to try. And I loved cooking so much that I had the chance to start sharing that with other people. And then I started to get really positive feedback and people would be like, wow, this tastes so good. What's the secret? And I felt kind of bad when they would ask, because most of the time, if someone says, hey, this cooking tastes really good, it's because of one of these things. It's usually a salt, a fat, an acid, or some kind of aromatic thing, right? Like, I really can't take credit here. Now, what I want to point out about, things like salt or garlic or herbs or butter or cream or lemon or olive oil, those things are all disgusting on their own, right? You wouldn't sit down and eat a stick of butter. You wouldn't sit down and toss a spoonful of salt in your mouth, because it'd be gross. But it turns out when you work those things into meals and dishes, it does a really good job of bringing out the flavors of other things and tying the dish together. In other words, these things are the context of flavor, right? We're looking for whatever that is when it comes to learning. So to give you a different idea of what that would look like, if all of these blocks and shapes and triangles and squares represented our information that we're trying to share with learners, the context is the information that exists between those things. In other words, it's the information that helps the learners figure out how those pieces of content fit together into a larger whole. Now, there are a couple of strategies that we use for this. One that's really popular, and can I be honest for a second? In education, we are really bad at branding things, aren't we? Like, I don't know who came up with the idea to call a really popular educational learning strategy chunking, but it is what it is. So the general idea behind chunking is that you're taking these really complex items and you're breaking them into smaller pieces for your audience, and then you're trying to fit them into structures that they're probably already familiar with. One of the best examples I love to give is, if you've ever learned a foreign language, my guess is that they taught you a song so that you could remember the verb conjugations. And that's one of those ideas of those structures that you can use. But you wouldn't give a learner a ton of stuff all at once, because that's really overwhelming, right? You would break it into smaller, meaningful pieces, and you give it to them through things like metaphors, which we just used. But if you are breaking content into smaller pieces so that you're not overwhelming your learners, you also have to go through a process called recoding or re-encoding, which is where you show the learners how those pieces fit back together. So if all of our content is, if you want to think of it like Lego bricks, then your job is to be the manual that shows how those bricks all fit back together to make something a bit more meaningful. There are other areas that we can add context to a course that aren't as obvious. Now, the obvious one, though, is alt text, right? We know that we should be putting alt text on our images, because what alt text does is it provides that behind the scenes context for someone who is blind or visually impaired who's using a screen reader, because the screen reader is going to read the alt text, which is a description of the image. And that's a really obvious one. But alt text is actually not as important as the context for that image. And alt text is actually a lot easier to write than some people think. I've noticed that there seems to be a lot of anxiety surrounding this, where it's like, what am I supposed to write? How do I do this? And it's actually pretty simple to write alt text. I'm going to give you a tip. This is one activity that I used to do with folks in live sessions, where I would show this image of the Twitter logo, and I would say, go ahead and write the alt text that you think should be used for this image. And I would get things like a blue bird facing to the right. One person wrote something like, it was my favorite. They wrote a paragraph of alt text. It was like a blue bird facing to the right that represents the logo of Twitter. The CEO is Jack Dorsey. They started in 2006. And I was like, that's so much information. And it's so unnecessary, because if I were writing alt text for this image, I would just write Twitter, because that's what the image means. The image means Twitter. The only time I would change that is if clicking that logo meant that I was about to share whatever was on that page to Twitter, then that's an action, right? So I would say share to Twitter. So some simple rules of thumb for alt text, just to make it a little bit simpler and a bit more approachable. Just include a short description of whatever the image is. Do include text if there's text in the image. And if clicking that image, actually, if that image is a link that's going to take them somewhere else, include where the link would actually take them. But you don't have to say things like image of. It's already implied that it's an image because it's alt text. It's only attached to images. And you don't really need descriptions of decorative images. So if something's there just for show, you can write NULL for null, and you'll be fine. But if you need a trick, one of my favorites is this. There's a mobile app called Seeing AI for iOS. It's available for iPhone and iPad. I love this app. It's actually for the blind and visually impaired, and it's meant to give you an idea of what you're looking at. And they have modes for money and different things like that. But one thing that I really like about it is, I'm going to play a really quick video clip here that I took a little screencast on my phone. It has a share sheet option in iOS, so that I can open up a photo in my Photos app, and then tap the share icon, and then there's an option that says recognize with seeing AI. So recognize with seeing AI, and then it'll guess what it's looking at. Now, this video moved pretty quickly, so I took a little screenshot of the end here. And this is what the screenshot of the end was. And it came up with a scene description and a person description here. Now, I can just turn around and use this information as a basis for my alt text if I'm really struggling to come up with how to describe this. So I would probably borrow the scene description. The scene description is probably a person and a couple of children sitting on a couch with a laptop. And I would change it to something like a person sitting at a table with a laptop and a couple of children playing on a couch in the background, right? So a little bit simpler than it seems, and it took me all of 10 seconds to run that through. The alt text is pretty easy to put together. Where I would encourage you to spend more time investing when it comes to images is actually learning to write proper captions. Captions are the best version of context for images. You should still have your alt text, but it's meant to be used sparingly. It's not meant to have these really long descriptions. So captions are where you would provide more context for all of your learners, not just the ones who are using a screen reader. Let me give you another example. For this image, if I were to write the alt text of this image, it would be 2 young Black women taking a selfie with a smartphone. Now that's perfect alt text, but it doesn't provide as much context as a caption. And so for a caption, I might write, members of the millennial and Gen Z generations frequently use smartphones to save, document, and share their personal experiences with others. These practices often include capturing selfies, which are photos of themselves. These photos are often taken at places of interest or with others they have a meaningful attachment to. And you can hear the difference between those two, hopefully, or see the difference between those two. One is meant to be a very quick description, and the caption that I just read out loud, that provides much more context for this image. Another really simple way to provide more context in your design is including regular summaries. And this isn't just for courses or documents or things like that. This can also be for class meetings or business meetings. It's really helpful to do because you can talk about where have we been, and where are we now, and where are we going next? And those simple check-ins help just about everyone. And not only that, if we're talking about learning, one of the things that really helps learning is activating prior knowledge. So reminding your learners of where they have just been is a really helpful starting point because now that prior knowledge is present mind. This works well for presentations, it works well for meetings, it works well for consultations, helps refresh the memory, and not only that, it helps reduce anxiety about forgetting things, and everyone ends up on the same page. So I know it seems like you might be doing this for just 1 or 2 people, but filling in those gaps really helps everyone. So that's a bit about context. The next C was compassion, right? That was the next characteristic that I wanted to talk about, and that was about making yourself more accessible as well. One of the things you may have noticed over the past year is, especially if you work in the world of education, is now you have students who are probably attending remotely and face-to-face, some sort of blend in there, or fully remotely, and that can be pretty challenging, but it also opens up a brand new avenue for other students, and it proves that it's possible for us to make space for virtual students even when we're leading a primarily face-to-face course. There are some other things that we've learned about over the past year and over the past couple of years that are also pretty important when it comes to just incorporating compassion into how you write materials, how you communicate with others. One of those is the language that we use when we talk with others. So it's not just what you say, but it's also how you say it. And one simple framework that I would encourage you to think about is reframing your wording when it comes to accessibility. Historically, we have said, you know, a disabled person, a blind person, a deaf person, a depressed person, an autistic person. The preference now is that we flip that language around so that it is person first language, because ultimately that person is a person first. So that's a person who's living with a disability, a person who happens to be blind or deaf, a person who's living with depression, a person who is autistic, right? Not an autistic person, but a person who is autistic. So that person first language, I know it seems like a simple thing, but it can actually have a pretty big difference in terms of making people feel like they belong in the situation and not that they're being labeled as their impairment. Remember earlier I said it's easy to overlook people outside our zone of normal. I see this all the time, or I saw this all the time pre-COVID times when I would go to conferences and there would be a microphone available and the person would go, you know, I don't need the microphone. And the key word in that sentence is I. Like, I know that I'm loud enough for me to hear myself. And it always drove me a little crazy because that person was immediately putting every deaf or hard of hearing person within the audience, or a person who's living with, or a person who's deaf in the audience, as having to out themselves and say, like, I actually can't hear very well. I have a hearing impairment. Could you please use the microphone? When in reality, they could have just used the microphone, right? They could have just used the microphone that was there. Not only that, we do have a number of people who have experienced so much judgment because of the conditions that they live with that they have chosen to mask or hide those. For example, one thing that's really popular or really common with folks who have autism is they will mask their tics or their characteristics so that they could appear a little bit more neurotypical, is the term. So what you'll find is that folks who come to you and say, like, oh, hey, I have an accommodation, or just to let you know, I'm on the spectrum, it may not be immediately obvious because they have learned to navigate a neurotypical world by pretending that they are someone or something that they are not, right? So keep in mind that it's easy to overlook people outside of our zone of normal for a couple of different reasons, but one is that they feel the need to hide who they are because of fear of judgment or for any number of other reasons. Really horrible phrases like, why can't you just be normal, right? I can guarantee that just about every neurodivergent person out there has heard that phrase at some point, probably during childhood, and it had an impact. So the language that we use can be really, really important. Another thing that can be really helpful in terms of compassion is providing multiple pathways to the exact same destination. And again, I know for the business folks and for the higher ed folks, we want those face-to-face interactions, right? We want people to be physically present in the classroom so that we can see them, so that we can interact with them. Right now, one of the biggest challenges for me as a presenter is I can't see any of you. I get no nonverbal feedback whatsoever. I can't tell if you love this session or if you hate it, or if you're like, man, that guy's being kind of like weird right now, or this is such a great session, I'm so glad I signed up. I don't get any of that feedback right now because I can't see you. But what I know is that right now you are all in very different places. And you are watching from different platforms. I know some of you are watching on Facebook so that you can have the live captioning available to you. And some of you are watching from other areas. In other words, we're providing multiple pathways to the same session, even if it's a little bit harder for us in some circumstances, because we want to make sure that as many people as possible can join. So if COVID's proven anything, it's that we can successfully work remotely, both in the business and academic worlds. If you think about students who have a mobile impairment, as an example, you providing the option for them to remotely join the class, even though COVID is now reaching a point where it's becoming better managed, and we're probably going to have a very different fall than we did last year. Being able to have the option to join the class remotely would be huge for students who, let's say, have a mobile impairment and are on a campus that is not designed for people with mobile impairments. It can also help out all sorts of other students, if you think about it. If you have students who are commuting and who have financial burdens because, let's say, they're supporting multiple family members, or they might be living in poverty, and they can't really afford gas to come to campus that day, being able to join remotely is huge. You might even have students who are living with anxiety or depression, and they don't want to disclose that. And it's not necessarily something that they have a registered impairment for, but it's something that is, let's say, more time limited, and they just feel overwhelmed, but they still want to keep up with class. Being able to join remotely is a huge benefit. So I know that sometimes creating those multiple pathways can be a bit of an inconvenience for us on the instructor side, but it opens up so many more opportunities for the learners, and that's who it's ultimately about. Right. So that compassion and that accessibility, it's not necessarily about making the content accessible, it's about making yourself accessible. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, the next characteristic was clarity. I kind of jokingly say that it's like Marie Kondo, but for your computer. There are a couple of different ways that you can offer more clarity to your learners. And one of the best ones is simplicity, so just what you need and nothing more. if you have ever prepped a meal before, you know that the ingredients that you took out to make the meal were only the ingredients that went into that meal. You didn't take everything out of the fridge. You didn't take everything out of the pantry or everything off of the spice rack. You just took out the things that you needed, because if you add a bunch of extra stuff, then it starts to become a little complicated. And if, like me, I'm just going to own it. If you're one of the folks like me who just treats the island as backup storage for your house, then every once in a while there's extra stuff on your preparation space, and that's a hassle too. So it's about taking the things that you don't need out of the learning experience and focusing just on what you do, but also looking for areas where you can optimize your content. There are a lot of folks out there who went into an LMS for really the first time ever in a serious way last March. And they've spent the past year doing their best to try and keep up with rapidly changing circumstances and build out content. And now there are a good number of folks out there who have these courses that are very, very long, because they dumped everything in there that they could possibly think of, and they were trying to build all these videos and everything else. Now would be a really good time for, through the lens of Moodle in particular, learning about course formats that might help show the students less at any given moment, or learning to build that content into things like Moodle books or the H5P interactive book that can take a lot of information, sort it in a meaningful way with a table of contents, and compress it a bit so that the students aren't as overwhelmed by what's there. There's some other things that you can do. Clarity can take the form of cues that you provide to students. These could be audible or visual clues that you provide during class sessions or learning sessions. One of my favorite things I've ever seen in a presentation that I thought was really clever was the presenters included this bar across the top, and it would update as you moved through the presentation. And it really just showed where were they just now, what was the current topic, and what's the next topic. And it was relatively unobtrusive. It just lived at the top, and it let me know during that presentation where we were and what to expect. It just reduced that burden, and it gave me a bit more of a clue in terms of what we were looking for, because let's be honest, our attention wanders. I can guarantee several of you, and actually, let's be honest, all of you at some point, your attention has wandered during this session, and it's through no fault of your own. You know, it's not that I'm a bad presenter or anything like that, or you're like, man, he kind of looks like Seth Rogen, and I've been thinking about it the whole time. It's that your attention just wanders. It happens, right? It's really hard to focus on one thing for quite a while. And so that's completely normal. And if you happen to have your phone nearby, then you have like a perpetual stimulation device that's even more distracting, right? So having these little cues so that when you rejoin the session can be really, really helpful. Clarity also comes down to areas like giving directions to learners. This is where clarity and context start to meet. In fact, a lot of these characteristics, they work really well together. They don't just exist in a silo. So I'm just trying to give more extreme examples here. But one of the things I used to give as a simulated example / activity for folks to try is emailing directions for how someone would visit you in your office. So if we were, let's say, on a college campus or in a corporate building, when you would give directions to someone to get to your office, are you including how to reach the elevator, right? One of the things that I saw pretty frequently and that I caught myself doing is when I would email students in an orientation course I was teaching to say like, hey, come meet me for office hours. I would say, you know, go to the stairs at this part of the building, go up to the second floor, and then meet me here. And all of the directions were through the lens of taking the stairs to the second floor. Like all the directions were walk down the hallway, it's on the left. And that's because they were coming from the stairs. The elevators were in the complete opposite corner of the building. So even simple things like this, providing extra context in directions, I really feel like in directions, we don't want to be overly prescriptive, but clarifying questions ahead of time that you're expecting people might ask is just going to help reduce that decision-making burden that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So when it comes to things like giving directions, even something as simple as emailing someone directions for how to visit your office can have a really big impact. And that brings us to the last characteristic, which is consistency. And that's about knowing where to go and what to do when you get there. Consistency is really important to us in general, isn't it? We hate when things are out of line or just out of place and just a little bit. For some reason, it just sticks with us. So having consistency can be really helpful from a wide variety of perspectives. It's really great for learners because it lets them know what to expect. This is where we're kind of coming in with some clarity as well. Letting them know what to expect so that there aren't really any major surprises, because surprises mean you have to kind of retool how you're thinking about the day. This is something that happens in a wide variety of circumstances. Let me give you an example. Routines are incredibly important, because these are just things like habits and systems. And we're not just talking about classes here. We're talking about like business meetings, right? Having meetings that are structured in the same way, that are run the same way. There can still be flexibility to do whatever you want within that time, but blocking out, consistent spaces in there where you know that at the beginning, we're going to do a quick recap of the last meeting, and here's where we talk about this, and this is the spot where we'll do, really whatever we were going to do this time. It reduces anxiety. It lets people know what to expect. And it just helps create a bit of consistency. Since they don't have to make decisions or figure out what's about to happen next, you're reducing the burden for everyone, not just the folks with, let's say, ADHD who actually have a surplus of attention. They're very good at hyper-focusing, but where they really struggle is something called executive dysfunction. So it comes down to like making decisions. So you've already reduced the burden of trying to figure out what's going on. One thing that I really found interesting is some of the faculty that I've kept up with from my last institution have been doing a lot of information gathering from their students over the past year. And one of the things that the students said was incredibly helpful for them was when the instructor would send out weekly reminders, both through email and through video within the course. The reason that they found that to be helpful is because there was so much going on, and the cognitive load of just trying to deal with everything during COVID, and my roommate's in quarantine, do I need to go into quarantine? And oh, my mom might have COVID now. All that stuff can be really overwhelming. So these weekly reminders are just a simple thing that we can do for our learners that let them know, A, here's where we are, here's where we're going, here's what's happening next, this is what you should be most focused on. So again, reducing the burden. But not only that, it hit on the compassion characteristic as well. It turns out the students who got regular messages from their instructors said they felt like the instructor actually cared about them. And that helped make the semester more bearable because there was someone out there who was showing them even a small bit of kindness. So these are things that do require a little extra work on our part from the instructor perspective, but they're remarkably helpful. It's not just a good reset for our neurodivergent students, but it's something that makes all the students feel like they're cared for, right? Like that, the goal in teaching is not to see who sinks or who swims. The goal is for the learners to learn something. And part of what makes that successful is when they feel like the person teaching them actually cares about and is invested in their success. That consistency can also be really simple things like making sure that you're using consistent headings in the documents that you create, using consistent headings in the courses that you build. That repetition is really helpful because it helps you skim ahead. And these headings are helpful for screen readers, by the way, because most folks using screen readers are going to navigate through by skipping between the different headings. If you're not using the headings feature, either in Word or let's say in Moodle, then the screen readers don't know where those headings are. If you have a heading and you're like, okay, I'm going to highlight that and select bold and change it from 12 to 16 point, then, now it looks like a heading. It's not styled as a heading behind the scenes. So if you're selecting that text, you want to click on like heading 1 or heading 2, heading 3 in the styles drawer in Word or in the drop-down menu in the Addo text editor in Moodle so that those headings are consistent. They're accessible to students who are using screen readers, but it makes the course look nicer and it makes it much easier when you're scrolling through to figure out, okay, this is a new section. This is what that section is about. It's really simple to do. It takes seconds to put in your headings tags, and it provides a bit of consistency across your courses and learning materials. So just as a quick recap, we've got context, which is the information that exists between the information. So while alt text is important, what's even more important is including captions with rich descriptions that contextualize the information in those images, as an example. Compassion, right? Not just making your content accessible, but making yourself accessible as well, making the learning environment accessible to folks, especially if they can't always join physically. Clarity, just making it crystal clear to folks where we are, where are we going, what are we doing, and that consistency so that they know what to expect, and it reduces that burden of decision making. Now, this was very top level. We didn't really have time to do demos. We didn't want to do live demos where we might risk, Right now I'm at the mercy of Spectrum Home Internet, so if that cuts out on me, then all of a sudden there goes the demo. So we wanted to focus more on these top level characteristics. We're actually going to dig more into these in a couple of weeks in a course that Amy Tessitore and I are leading called Accessible and Inclusive Course Design. I've put the link on the screen. I believe Maddie's also going to include it in the chat for you. So if you wanted to learn more about that course, please do consider enrolling. We're going to talk more about what these characteristics look like specifically within the context of course design and learning materials design within Moodle. But there are some other tools that you can look at in the meantime, and I want to turn it back over to Jaime to talk about one of those.
Thanks, Michael. So we do have a tool that you can use to assist you with your existing content, as well as anything that you may be in the process of creating, that allows institutions to really make what they have going on more inclusive. It is called Ally, and we have lots of individuals here in our organization that specialize in the use and implementation of Ally. What Ally does is it provides information regarding the inclusive nature of your content for both students, educators, and institutions. And what that looks like is on the student level, it has automated, accessible versions of content. On the instructor level, it gives instructor feedback on content in regards to how that content is performing from an accessibility standpoint so that they can make the necessary changes to align with those goals. And then also for the institution, it provides institutional reporting that allows you to see how your larger organization is doing in regards to meeting the accessibility needs of your group. So it really does provide a well-versed ecosystem of accessibility by using the tool Ally. And if you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to us after the session today, and we'll put you in touch with an Ally expert. Now, just to show you that we really do have proof in the pudding in regards to the power of Ally, it is used in over 800 institutions worldwide. We have 62 million courses processed via Ally, and we have 2 billion, that's billion with a B, folks, that's a lot, 2 billion content items processed with Ally since 2017. So we have been enriching and improving the product for quite a while now to make sure that your environment is inclusive and engaging. And we really want to make sure that everyone has access to your materials. You spend a lot of time on your materials, so the more people that can engage with them, the better. So whether it's using a tool like Ally or attending a session like we're going to have in June to improve your content moving forward, we really encourage you to focus on accessibility as you move forward, because it really does matter. Thanks, Michael.
All right, I keep forgetting I have to mechanically unmute myself, so I'm back, but I did include a little bit more information about the accessible and inclusive course design here on the screen. But at this point, we're also open to answer any questions you may have in the chat, and I'll just switch back over here.
Thank you, Jaime and Michael. As Michael mentioned, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat now. We have a few minutes here to ask any. I will address this question. Yes, the recording will be made available. This exact same YouTube link that you logged on with will be available as a recording. As I mentioned at the top, live closed captions were on Facebook, but once this processes as a recording, YouTube should also have closed captioning on it as well. And then I think that was the only question I saw. Thank you everyone who engaged in the chat. Everyone seems very excited. Again, as Michael mentioned, we can continue this conversation if you want to dive deeper in this accessibility course, which he is one of the instructors on. So that is a great option. But I don't see any additional questions coming in. So I just want to take this moment to thank Jaime and Michael for their time here and their expertise. I also will recommend that everyone go over to community.openlms.net. That's a great place where we can continue that conversation. I will just add that that is not restricted to just OpenLMS clients, OpenLMS people. That is a community that is open for everyone to come have conversations about e-learning, engage, and everything like that. But thank you all so much for joining. Please feel free to share this with your colleagues, share this link around, and we hope to see you on another session soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.